This is the Voice of Russia in London. Today we're marking 70 years since a momentous event of the Second World War, Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944. I'm Dmitry Linnik. With me in the studio are Nikolai Gorshkov, a Russian journalist and historian, and Richard Overy, a British historian who's written extensively about the Second World War, and particularly about the war on the Eastern Front. In the small hours of June 6, 1944, General Eisenhower and his staff gathered at their headquarters just outside Portsmouth, listening to the sound of driving rain and gale-force winds that threatened to derail the cross-channel attack on Hitler's fortress Europe, which took years to agree, months to prepare. The group was in drooping spirits. The window of opportunity for the start of Operation Overlord seemed to have shut closed. Then, as if by miracle, the downpour suddenly stopped. Eisenhower thought for a few moments and spoke quietly, "Okay, let's go." His words heralded the opening of the Second Front against Nazi Germany, a momentous event in East-West relations, or Second Front in Europe. 1 week into the fighting on the Western Front, answering a question of a Pravda correspondent about his assessment of the D-Day landings, the Soviet leader Stalin said, "We can say without doubt this is a brilliant success of our allies. The history of wars doesn't know another endeavor equal in design, scope, and mastery of execution. History will mark this out as an achievement of a highest order." How do we get an idea of the scale of the operation in terms of the scale of the Second World War? Nothing could probably come close to that in terms of scale of fighting. So how significant was Operation Overlord in strictly military terms, Professor Overy?
Well, I think we need to remember, of course, that what makes Overlord special is that it's an amphibious operation. Amphibious warfare in the Second World War was extremely difficult and extremely risky. And so being able to get all those ships across the Channel, all those men ashore and secure within a number of weeks, that was what made this a particularly difficult and a particularly special operation.
150,000 men taken over the English Channel in a variety of boats, dinghies, quite a massive operation indeed, still on the scale. Again, just this morning, actually, Max Hastings, another prominent writer about the Second World War, about D-Day, Operation Overlord in particular, he mentions the fact that 92% of German manpower was dealt with on the Eastern Front by the Russians. I don't want to belittle, of course, the scale of Operation Overlord, but still, in strictly military terms, was it more military than political?
Well, D-Day was certainly a military operation, but it had political consequences, of course, because it finally persuaded Stalin and the Soviet people and the Soviet armed forces that here was at last a serious effort on the part of the Western allies. But I think it is very important to get this into perspective. It's not a question of more divisions on the Eastern Front, fewer divisions in the West, which is true. It's really a question of what else the allies, Western allies, were doing. America, of course, was fighting a major campaign in the Pacific, absorbing quite a large proportion of its military effort. There was also the war in Italy, which, though much smaller in scale than both these other conflicts, tied down a lot of German divisions. But above all, of course, there was the bombing campaign. I've argued recently that the bombing campaign, in fact, was not very effective in terms of its economic aims. It's aimed to demoralize the German people and so on. But what it did do was to tie down the German Air Force in German airspace. By the end of 1944, 80% of all German fighters were fighting in the Reich. And that meant, of course, that in Italy, in France for D-Day, on the Eastern Front, the Germans had far fewer aircraft available. And that made a big difference to the way in which armies could move forward. So I think it's unrealistic just simply to compare a number of divisions with a number of divisions. The Allies had a lot of other responsibilities, military responsibilities, and they had to conduct all of those at the same time. And for the Americans, they had to conduct it across 3,000 miles of ocean, which in itself, I think, quite a remarkable achievement.
Nikolai Gorshkov, talk in Russia was since, well, practically the end of 1941 about a second front. Our fathers, mine definitely and probably yours, told us about, opening the second front. That was opening canned beef that Russians would get from the States back then. How was the whole idea of the second front perceived in Russia, in the Soviet Union?
Russia really desperately needed real Allied action during the first phase of the war, when the situation on the Eastern Front was really desperate. Russia was very much relieved by the verbal support, first from Great Britain and then from the United States of America, the declarations by the leaders that they would be supporting Russian or Soviet war effort. But they needed some tangible manifestation of that, and Stalin raised the issue of the Second Front almost immediately. I think it was in September 1941. He said that once the situation on the Russian front a bit stabilized before the push towards Moscow later in the autumn, it was a good opportunity for Western allies actually to conduct at least some raids on northern France. And actually the initial request from the Soviet government was not about setting up a full-scale front in northern France. The talk was about raids on ports like Cherbourg or Le Havre. Now, of course, there was a great discussion about whether it was possible at all or not. The view of the Soviet government and of Stalin was that it was possible. The view, especially of Churchill, was that it was too risky. And, of course, having been bruised by the Dunkirk catastrophe, it's only understandable that Churchill was really averse to any notion of an early raid.
When did the idea of the Second Front in Europe originate? There was toing and froing. How did the debate start?
I think it's important to distinguish here between the attitude of the British and the attitude of the Americans. The British had been defeated almost everywhere. They were extremely cautious and worried by 1942, 43. The Americans had come into the war, and once they were in it, they wanted to win it. And I think it's fair to say that the Americans had a much better strategic grasp of what was necessary in the Second World War than the British ever did. Churchill was always
Despite the experience that the Brits had.
No, I know, despite that. But the British were always inclined to think about the periphery, about how you could exploit your naval power, perhaps, in a more effective way. And right from the start, the Americans said the only way you're going to win this war is by bringing troops into Europe to fight and defeat the German army. And so from 42 onwards, that was always the American aim. When they sent the 8th Air Force, the bomber force, to Britain in 1942, their instructions initially were to prepare to help an invasion of Europe in 1942. They were not designed to be bombing Germany. Then when the invasion couldn't be mounted, they turned their attention to bombing Germany. But right from the start, the Americans always saw it that way. And whether the British liked it or not, they had to comply. They needed American assistance of every kind.
The Brits, Churchill, I understand, initially promised the Second Front in Europe for 1942. Was that genuine?
No, I don't think it was. He was desperate to keep the Russians on side, desperate to persuade Stalin that the sacrifices that Soviet forces were making were worth something. He tried to persuade Stalin that the bombing of Germany was in some sense a second front. He tried to play up all the time what was happening in the Mediterranean. But in the Mediterranean, of course, until October 1942, the British record there was disastrous. So there was nothing you could really say to Stalin to persuade him that relying on the British and the British armed forces were going to achieve very much.
The two sides, the Brits, specifically the Brits, before the Americans had to go in, the Brits and the Soviet Union, in the run-up to the war, there was a lot of bad blood and mistrust, essentially, that went deep, 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 going back to at least 1939, at least in the Western parlance, and in Russian perception, it goes back to 1938. So the legacy of mistrust that was formed over those 2 years at least, the momentous events such as Munich, and then, of course, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, these things undermined any hope of genuine alliance. What would you say, Nikolai Gorshkov?
Well, exactly so. Actually, we have to remember that during the Soviet-Finnish War in 1940, actually Britain and other Western countries helped Finland. The Soviet Union, really up to the invasion of Germany, was considered by Britain and other Western countries as an ally of Germany, because the view from the West was that the war was started by attacking Poland from two sides. Obviously, we know the prehistory of that Soviet Union was trying to create a system of collective security in Europe it failed. I mean, they couldn't agree, Britain, France, and Poland actually. Poland was the sticking point here because Poland would not, or Romania, they would not agree to allowing the passage of Soviet troops to defend other countries if Germany attacks. And in the Soviet perspective, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was a desperate attempt to avert Germany attacking the Soviet Union. But eventually, when the war started, and there was this unfortunate incident of the Finnish War, it was kind of a proof to the West that the Soviet Union was Germany's side. And of course, when Churchill immediately on the day of the attack, the German attack on the Soviet Union, declared his support for the Soviet Union, it was, in a way, could have come as a surprise to quite a few people, because up to that point, Britain was not considering the Soviet Union as an ally. So that was a very difficult point in the relationship when both sides were so suspicious of each other that the declaration of British support for the Soviet Union and the immediate acceptance by Stalin of cooperation with Britain was an achievement in itself.
Richard Overy, you touched upon all of these things in your book, The Road to War. How difficult was it for the Brits and for the Russians, for the Soviets, to reconcile themselves to the fact that they're actually on the same side? They have to be.
It was very difficult, and I think I would take back the era of distrust all the way back to 1917. The real fundamental problem is that the Soviet regime regarded Britain, rightly of course, as a major imperial and capitalist power, and Britain and France regarded the Soviet Union, of course, as the home of communism and a threat to everything. So that there's a fundamental ideological division which exists between the two states. In 1941, when Germany attacks the Soviet Union, Churchill makes this famous speech in the House of Commons in which he says, I don't like communism at all. I've never liked it. I still don't like it. But anybody fighting Hitler is going to be a friend of mine. And that's really what bound the two together. It was a fundamental link, of course, because they were both fighting Hitler and they both wanted to see German defeat. But it masked, in fact, the survival of a profound distrust, I think, on both sides as to what imperialist Britain might do or what communist Soviet Union might do. And that distrust, of course, opened up again immediately in 1945.
What was, in material terms, a threat that the West should have been afraid of in the run-up to the war? Was the Soviet Union really a threat, if not ideologically, then militarily, economically?
It wasn't really a threat militarily, although the British, of course, spent a lot of time trying to find out exactly what Soviet intentions were for India, for example. And they did see the Soviet Union in the mid-30s as a potential threat to British and French interests in the Middle East and in South Asia. It seems bizarre now because there were no plans, Soviet plans to invade these areas. But the British were obsessed with the threat that communism represented, almost more than the threat that fascism represented. It was only when Hitler appeared to be out of control, finally in 1939, that the British decided this was the greater threat to their imperial interests than any threat represented by the Soviet Union.
Just a reminder that this is the Voice of Russia in London. We're marking 70 years since the landing in Normandy in 1944 on June the 6th. I'm Dmitry Linnik, and we're talking to Nikolai Gorshkov, a Russian journalist and historian, and Dr. Richard Overy, a British historian who's written extensively about the Second World War, specifically about the war in the East. Now, the fact that the Second Front in Europe was opened so late in the day, in the Soviet Union, it led many people to believe, including top leadership, but also a fair number of people sort of on the ground, that Britain and America were not really sincere in fighting on the same side as the USSR. And at least to a degree, the perception was that the postponement of the Second Front was meant to bleed the Soviet Union and Germany to death, to weaken them as much as possible. Do you think that came into the calculations of Western politicians and military leaders, Richard Overy?
I don't think so at all, in fact. That even though the British and Americans had to swallow hard and collaborate with communism, their top priority was the defeat of Hitler. They rightly saw, I think, Hitler as the real threat to European security. They didn't want the Soviet Union to lose. If the Soviet Union had lost or had made peace with Hitler, huge resources from Eurasia would have been available for the German war effort. The invasion of Europe might never have been possible. They recognized that. The real problem is they're so restricted in what they can actually do in 1942. I think the other issue, in explaining the Soviet